Good morning and welcome to the Going Mad for CTI and Attack. We're excited that you have chosen to spend your time with us. And we have some great content that we are focused on enhancing your threat intelligence through attack. And we're looking forward to hearing from all of you also at the MAD for CTI booth following the presentation. So moving to the agenda for this session, just here's a bird's eye view of what Jackie and I are going to be talking through today. We're going to start out by outlining the MITRE Attack Defender CTI training, and then we're moving on to how to use attack for CTI. In this section, we'll be doing some raw data mappings from ransomware that are included in the latest attack version, and then we're going to be doing a short demo of some of the new navigator features. And then finally, we're going to be sharing some tips and best practices for mapping, some associated resources, as well as some frequently asked questions. So just to start out, my name is Amy. I'm currently a cyber operations lead at MITRE, and I primarily focus on cyber threat intelligence for space assets and weapon systems. I'm also the content lead for the attack team. I provide CTI support for attack evaluations, and I support MITRE's International Cyber Capacity Building Program. And I was also one of the instructors for the MAD CTI course. I've been working in cyber for over a decade now. I didn't actually start my career in cyber. I kind of moved around a little bit. So after my undergrad, I spent some time in Russia and a couple of years in China in a development capacity. And then I moved to congressional affairs and state level lobbying, focusing on information technology and security. And I began supporting DHS and international cybersecurity, managing the European and Central Asian cyber engagement portfolio. And in this role, I was able to kind of merge those development and information security elements and to leverage them for the efforts for threat intelligence collaboration and improving incident response capabilities with partner countries. And this role also featured CTI at a strategic level as part of our work was assessing the global threat landscape and the emerging threats and determining how best to coordinate with international partners to address them. So then I continued with a role working with US CERT and the NKIC, which many of you might be aware, were rolled into the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I was focusing on emerging threats and strategic communications and consulting on cyber risk assessments. So I've been working in different aspects of CTI since then, but I think my background really demonstrates that you can come into CTI with a non-technical or otherwise unorthodox background, kind of develop the necessary skill sets to succeed in the field. A couple of organizations focused on international development and social justice. And I also spend a lot of time building forts and fighting monsters with my 3 kids and preparing for the arrival of the 4th in a few months.
All right, hi. So my name is Jackie Lasky, and I'm a senior cybersecurity engineer with MITRE. I've been here for almost 4 years now, and I was an instructor and contributor to the MAD CTI course through Ingenuity. I've been lucky enough to gain experience working with lots of different skill areas throughout my time at MITRE, but my main interests are in CTI, data science, Python machine learning, and threat detection and analytics. I've worked on all kinds of attack-related things since I joined originally as an intern. So helping out on the core CTI team with processing contributions and adding new things like groups and software that we track, creating the threat report attack mapper tool, TRAM, which some of you may have heard of, attack evals, attack-based SOC assessments, and helping create these courses for Ingenuity. Before MITRE, I got my bachelor's in computer science. Like Amy said, we can all come to the field of CTI from all different kinds of backgrounds and skill sets, which makes it such a cool field. Outside of work, you can find me out in nature with my dog and my drone. I'm an amateur photographer and adventurer with my dog, Sora. I live in Denver, so I pretty much am always like hiking, skiing, camping, paddleboarding, pretty much anything outside. So yeah, we can go to the next slide.
So I'm just going to briefly kind of go over a little about how threat-informed defense leverages cyber threat intelligence. So as you may have seen Rich outlining in his keynote this morning, Threat-informed defense is an approach that applies just a really profound understanding of adversary tradecraft and technology to protect against, detect, and mitigate cyber attacks. And so CTI is a fundamental aspect of this threat-informed defense, and it provides kind of the deep insight into these evolving adversaries, their capabilities, their motivations, and their goals. And then it also improves the efficiency and effectiveness in terms of both detective and preventative capabilities by informing the actions that might need to be taken to defend against and counter those threats. And at MITRE, the core of our kind of threat-informed defense approach is the attack framework, outlining the real-world tactics and techniques used by cyber adversaries. And attack is built on a foundation of threat intelligence, and CTI informs each of attack's key use cases. So this focus on the adversary really enables us to identify common gaps and to develop innovative solutions. That allows us to provide vendors with an assessment of their ability to defend against specific adversaries by emulating known adversary behavior, and by closing the skills gap by empowering practitioners and defenders to effectively learn about threat-informed concepts. So for the rest of this session, we're going to be reviewing some of these aspects and how to apply attack to improve your threat intelligence.
So now we'll kind of talk about the MITRE Attack Defender CTI edition. Next slide. So what's in the MAD CTI training course? So the training consists of 4 different modules. In the course, we cover a bunch of essential topics to prepare students for learning how to leverage attack to improve their CTI practices. The training consists of both guided lessons, where we walk you through the material, as well as real-world hands-on material to practice what you learned, and then we have assessments to test how well you learned the material after. This course provides instruction in mapping open source threat reports and raw data to attack, efficiently storing and expressing the mapped intel, and operationalizing it through actionable recommendations to defenders. It's considered an intermediate course that focuses on identifying, analyzing, developing, and applying attack mapped intelligence. It's recommended that participants have a basic understanding of attack before they take the course, which is why we offer the Attack Fundamentals course beforehand that you can take prior to taking the CTI course. It also helps to have a little bit of security-related background or CTI field experience, but it's not super necessary for enrolling in the course. Next slide. So students who successfully complete the course should be able to map both narrative threat reporting and raw data to attack, effectively store and display attack map data. They should be able to leverage Attack Navigator for analysis and provide actionable defensive recommendations based on attack map data. We really want students to be able to take attack to their teams and be comfortable and confident using the framework for all kinds of organizational needs. We included the hands-on training exercises because we really believe that it will help reinforce the course content and help learners take away key skills that will be valuable to them in their field. Next slide. So now we'll talk a little bit about how we use CTI on our attack team. So like I mentioned before, I'm part of the core attack CTI team, which involves me helping maintain the groups and software contributions that you see on our site. So we review the latest cyber threats and reporting on adversaries across all types of security vendors. And we look at different types of malware across all different platforms like Linux, Windows, Mac OS, etc. We find reports of interest and we add it to our list, and then someone on the team reviews it afterwards. So the main role I have is reading these reports and extracting the attack techniques and procedure examples, much like how we teach in the narrative threat reporting training and the CTI training. So this requires that I stay up to date with the newest techniques and sub-techniques that get added so that we can best represent them in the reporting that we review. Throughout the past year, I've been heavily focusing on ransomware since I've been involved in another task that's helping hospitals learn how to defend against ransomware attacks. So basically, we've been working on that, and it's also led me to research more ransomware for our site, which has continued to build out coverage for those in our attack matrix. So we also help review any external contributions that we get submitted by those outside of MITRE. We take these submissions and we review them for accuracy, and we add or remove anything as necessary before sending it back to our contributors. And then we add it to our site, and it goes public a few times per year when we have our latest releases. And now I'll let Amy speak to some of the work that she's been doing with technique development and other things. So go ahead, Amy.
So as the content lead for attack, I contribute to the development of internal and external content and outreach efforts. And so any new content that is added to attack or is published by attack has to align with three core concepts. So it has to maintain the adversary perspective. It has to follow real world use of activity through empirical use examples. And then the level of abstraction has to be appropriate to bridge those offensive actions with the possible defensive countermeasures. So as I noted earlier, attack is built on this foundation of CTI, and it directly informs most aspects of the framework, including the groups and software, as Jackie just covered, but also all the new techniques and sub-techniques. So much of the adversary behaviors that are described by attack are largely drawn from publicly reported incidents. And so any new information relevant to attack techniques come from many different sources. Much of it is the attack team going out and proactively conducting threat research and staying current on adversary activities. And what we look at is threat intelligence reports, conference presentations, social media and blogs, open source code repositories, malware samples. But one of the most important sources are the community contributions that Jackie just mentioned. We rely very heavily on what the community is seeing in the wild. And this focus sharing and collaboration provides like a great force multiplier effect and ensures that attack remains really dynamic and relevant as adversaries are evolving their tools and tradecraft. So attack has a number of required criteria for adding new information to the framework. I won't go into all the details now. Instead, I want to highlight three benchmarks that we're consistently collecting, prioritizing and curating any new information around. So first, it has to align with the philosophy that I just went over. Second, it has to benefit the community's understanding of the adversary behavior. And then third, it has to actually improve how the community can defend against those behaviors. So from a technique perspective, the attack team leverages a CTI process for all the contributions and new content. We compare the contributions we receive with public information as well as other contributions. We determine if the contributions meet attack requirements and are appropriate have appropriate in the wild examples of proposed techniques or sub-techniques. And then for the most exciting part, we get to go and do extensive research, analysis, and mapping to identify any new or additional real-world activities that are aligned to proposed techniques or sub-techniques. And a source that we often leverage to incorporate into attack content is raw data. And so I mentioned this at a high level in on the agenda. I'm sure everyone has been waiting for this part of the presentation with bated breath. So a little background on why we included this section today. Mapping from raw data can seem really challenging or overwhelming if you're not consistently doing it, or if you haven't had the opportunity to do it before. There's a lot of information. It takes deeper analysis and specialized experience or knowledge often. And then while you might have to review a lot more data overall in order to figure out what the actual behavior is, it can also be a really rich source of detail on what the adversary is doing. And you can see this firsthand when you're analyzing the behaviors from the source data in comparison to reading about it from another analyst's perspective in a finished intel report. And a key advantage is that there's probably more information available at the procedure level. So, and then over the next few slides, I'll be walking through some samples of raw data from a ransomware family that was added to software in the current version of attack, displaying some of the attack mappings, and then highlighting some tips. Just for your awareness, we found out that animations are not supported on this platform. So some of the mappings for these slides are going to be already displayed. So I'm just giving the answers up front, essentially. So taking a look at this first sample, we can see there's a mutex created at the very top and left unobfuscated. We can see some window API functions. Next, we have some checks in the environment, and it looks like the adversary is looking for some very specific tools. And then we can see down at the bottom that the notifications are being disabled so that the user will not be alerted, and Windows command shell is being used to execute the commands. So with raw data, the first thing to do is, if you aren't familiar with any of the functions, the processes or the commands in a sample or report you're looking at, is to go do some analysis to identify what's happening and what the end goal likely is. And you can go to your favorite search engine or your favorite website and search out, the specific commands or functions to get an idea of what they mean, what the goal is, and to start building out a picture of what the adversary or software is doing. So in the sample we just looked at, we saw a few Windows API functions, including close handle. And if we do some research, we can determine that this function closes handles to numerous objects, including mutexes. And as the native function is being used, we can plug it into the search tool and attack. And this is an example of where a function pulled from raw data can lead us to the native API technique under the execution tactic. And so with native API, adversaries are interacting with a native OS API to execute behaviors. And you can see several examples under procedures of where groups or software have used a specific function for different outcomes. And so back to that sample, we also noted that there's a search for anti-malware products. And if we do a search on these executables, they're in a search engine separately, or if you're doing analysis in a sandbox, you can identify them as anti-malware security tools by Malwarebytes. And so we can determine that the goal would be would probably align with the discovery tactic. And under discovery, there's a pretty common technique, software discovery. And in this case, the sub-technique, security software discovery, where an adversary is attempting to get a listing of security software, including antivirus and other defensive tools. And this would align with that discovery behavior. And so you can see some of the procedure examples here where groups and software are working to identify security products on a compromised system. Now for the end goal of this sample, the notifications for the anti-malware tools are being disabled. So the user won't be alerted to the malicious behaviors. And in this case, we can determine that the adversary is trying to evade defenses, specifically by disabling those security tools to avoid that possible detection. And this aligns with impaired defenses, disable or modify security tools. So now you should feel a really great sense of accomplishment for mapping this sample to attack. As we discussed, you can see the native API with the functions. You can see the security software discovery. We have the impaired defenses, disable or modify tools. And then we have another function down at the bottom that aligns with native API and cmd.exe that maps to command and scripting interpreter, Windows command shell. So in the next couple of samples, I'm going to go over them very quickly just to highlight a couple of tips. So in episode 2 of this malicious behavior, we can see 3 samples where the ransomware is using that cmd.exe to help execute commands on the system. And we know from that previous sample that cmd.exe maps to command and scripting interpreter, Windows command shell. Next, we see some malicious commands executed to silently modify related registry keys, and this aligns to modify registry and impair defenses, disable or modify tools. And I wanted to use this example because as you become more familiar working with raw data, you're going to be able to instantly start recognizing what the likely technique mappings are with many of these commands and functions. So in our final episode of Map That Malicious Behavior, I wanted to highlight something important. So first off, we're going to run through this mapping and then on to the core takeaway. So based on the use of a ransomware binary specific to the victim, including an embedded 1024-bit RSA key, public key, and a unique ransom note, there are multiple processing threads that are being spawned to read each target into memory, encrypt the data using the Windows crypto API, write encrypted data to a new file, and then delete the original file. But deleting the original file is an example of a malicious behavior that isn't currently an attack. So you can see it down at the bottom in the red box. And we can speculate that if the software next overwrote the original file to make it irrecoverable, this would be data destruction under the impact tactic. But while attack features a file deletion subtechnique for defense evasion, it doesn't currently have a technique for just a deletion command for destructive purposes for impact. And I wanted to kind of bring this up because it illustrates two key points: that not every malicious behavior is an attack, and that tactics really matter. So now for a really exciting interlude to get you into action mode. We're going to be doing a one-question quiz to assess how familiar you are with ransomware families. If you go to minty.com on the device of your choice and input that code at the bottom, 19593425, you'll be able to assess your knowledge and how you stack up against everyone else who's doing it. And so as just a reminder, the ransomware we just mapped searches for security products and to disable them. It encrypts victim data before using the Windows Crypto API, and then it writes this encrypted data to a new file before the original is deleted. A couple of other hints: the group is thought to be a Russian language cyber criminal gang, and 6 suspects that were allegedly tied to the group were just arrested in June of this year. So I am just gonna share my screen so that we can we have several responses coming in. I'm going to give it another few seconds to allow some additional guesses. So the main one that is leading the pack is a great guess, especially if given the Russian language aspect. So going back to the slide deck, you can continue putting in some of your responses. But for those of you who identified CLOP, great job. And for everyone else, just remember that the most important thing is that you're now a raw data mapping expert. And that was probably I know that was a difficult quiz. So moving to Attack Navigator.
All right, thanks, Amy. So this past fall, Navigator released a few different features. One notable feature is that we can now use Navigator in a dark theme look, which you can see here. Users have been requesting that for a while, so I'm glad we got that in too. We also added support for Attack version 10 from our latest release, so all the updates can be seen now. Another feature that was included was that we combined the search and multi-select tools into a single user interface, which allows groups, software, and mitigations to be filtered alongside the techniques that are shown. This improves usability by moving the interface to like a sidebar, which you're going to see in just a few minutes, which can help for selection of the groups and software techniques. You'll also see the data sources panel there too, which got added recently. And lastly, we added a workflow for upgrading layers. So when you're upgrading a layer, you can view the techniques that have changed between the two versions, and then you can copy these annotations to a new layer. So now I'll go ahead. I'm going to try to do a live demo of this. We'll see if this platform allows me to. So I'm going to switch the screen to my tab. All right. Chrome. All right, so this, if you're seeing this, it should be the Attack Navigator tool. If you navigate to your browser, this is what it would look like. I do realize it's going to look kind of small on a demo version because everything is printed very small. So if you can't see what or follow along, it might be a little bit tricky. So if you've never heard of MITRE Attack Navigator, it's a web-based tool for annotating and exploring the attack matrices. It can be used to visualize defense coverage, red-blue team planning, and the frequency of detected techniques, and more. So when you navigate your browser to here, you have a couple different options. I'll just walk you through pretty much everything here. So the documentation for the tool is here. If you click here, you can see everything that you need to be able to use all the features that we have. And then we also have a change log, which shows all the new features that we've released and any fixes and bugs improvements. To get to the dark theme that I mentioned, you go here, and then this will give you obviously the dark theme. You can have it to use system, but we'll just keep it on light just for the presentation to keep it all brighter. So when you're creating a new layer, you have a couple different options. You can create a new empty layer for enterprise, mobile, or ICS. You can also use older versions that we have through here and click your domain as well. If you have an existing JSON file that you've gotten from a teammate or one that you've already saved to your computer, you can upload it from your local machine, or if it's embedded and you want to embed it in an iframe, you can load it from a URL and be able to have that like on a website and stuff with the URL there, which is very convenient. You can also create a layer from other layers, which I'll talk about in a little bit after we've created some empty layers. We'll use that feature to combine them. And then lastly, you can create a customized navigator layer as well. So we'll go ahead and create a new enterprise layer. You just click here. And for this demonstration, I'm going to be using two different pieces of ransomware that I worked on in the latest release that are newly added to attack. So for the first one, we're going to do a ransomware variant called Wasted Locker. So I will go ahead and type it up here in the description. I'll go through this too. It might be a little bit hard to see, so let me see if I can zoom in. So up in the top right corner, you have the selection controls, which kind of work with the different techniques that are selected. And then we also have the layer controls. So I'll kind of walk through each of these as well. So what I did here is I named it whatever we're going to call this file that we have. And you can add a description as well. So if I want to write Wasted Locker techniques, just to keep it separate from the other JSON file that we're going to create, that just gives it good metadata. When you're done, you can download it as a JSON file, or you can export it to Excel. And lastly, when we're done with this exercise, we'll render it to an SVG image file to be able to share it. These things are just for filters. So if you want to take off like Linux and you just want to have Windows or something, you can do that here, which is very convenient. This is for sorting, and this is a color setup. I'll zoom out again. I like to have this on just because it kind of gives a little bit of shading and makes it look a little prettier. You can change your gradient colors as well, but I won't be doing that today. These are for hiding and showing disabled techniques. You can expand sub-techniques. So this looks kind of busy when you have it all out here like that. So I'm going to go ahead and use this button to collapse it. And when we have all the techniques on here, we can expand just the annotated sub-techniques so it's not too busy. So now we'll go ahead and use the search and multi-select tool that I was talking about before. So now we have it on the sidebar, which is kind of nice. It's a little bit cleaner, not super busy up there. And we want to type in Wasted Locker, which is the ransomware variant that we're going to make for this navigator layer. So you'll see now that you can see a group that also uses the Wasted Locker variant, but we're going to go ahead and just select the techniques for Wasted Locker software. So we'll select them. Also, another cool thing is that you can go directly to the attack page from clicking the view button. And this takes you to MITRE attack software page for Wasted Locker. And if you didn't want to have to start the navigator layer from scratch, you have the options over here to be able to download the layer or just view it, and it'll give it a score and it'll highlight all the techniques for you, which is super nice. We have that on every software page. So I'll go back here. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and select the techniques for Wasted Locker. We're going to go up to the technique controls and we're going to give it a background color. It doesn't really matter what color, so we're just going to give it any color we see. And we'll give it a score of 1. So what the score does is you want to have a unique score for each layer so that when we combine one ransomware variant with another, we want to see the combined techniques, and they'll have a unique score added together from each of the 2 layers. So this one has a score of 1. So now we can close this, and we're going to go ahead and create a new layer. So we come up here and we click the new tab, and we create the layer just the same way that we did before. And for this one, we're going to go back over here to the layer information, and we're going to do the Cuba ransomware variant. So we'll type Cuba ransomware. Oops, I can't type. And we'll use our search tool like we did before as well. And we're just going to type it here. And we will select the techniques again as well. We can give it a different colors. Maybe we'll give it, just give it blue. And for this one, we're going to give it a different score than we assigned to the first tab, just so that we can recognize them as different layers when we combine them into one layer. So we're going to give it a score of 2. It doesn't really matter, like I said, which numbers. They just have to be different so that we can see when we combine the layers. I'll close that. And now we can use the other option that I talked about in the beginning. So we can create the layer from other layers. For this, we're going to select Enterprise version 10. And here's where you get to do a little bit of the score expressions. So these letters here correspond to the letters up here for each layer. So Wasted Locker is letter A, and Cuba ransomware is letter B. So we're just going to type A plus B, and essentially we had a score of 1 for A, and we get a score of 2 for B. So it'll just add them. And the combined techniques between the two variants are going to be a score of 3. So 1 plus 2, pretty simple. You don't have to fill out any of these unless you want to. I usually just leave it and create a new layer. So now you can see we have 3 different colors that represent 3 different things. So first we're going to name what our layer is, and we're just going to put combine TTPs. And we can put in the description, we have the Cuba, we'll put combined techniques for Cuba and Wasted Locker. So remember what we're doing. And then what also really helps is we can add a legend. So when you share this with someone, these colors actually mean something, which is good. So if you hover over, you'll see number scores for each of them. So we see a red one, which has a score of 1. And if you remember from before, we gave Wasted Locker a score of 1. So we'll go ahead and assign that one to that color. So these are the techniques just used by the Wasted Locker ransomware variant. So we're clicking a color here, we're assigning it red, because we see that the score is 1. If you hover over this, we see a score of 2. And if you remember from the Cuba ransomware, we gave it a score of 2. So we can go ahead and assign that one to the color yellow. Yellow. And then, yeah, this is very small though. Sorry, guys. Wish this was bigger. And lastly, we have a score of 3, which is the combined techniques that the Cuba ransomware variant and the Wasted Locker ransomware variant both share. So we'll just put down here, combine TTPs, and we'll give it a color of green. So now we'll have a legend, which is going to be useful. And lastly, what we can do is we can export this to an image file. So if you go up to the top where that little camera button is, like I said before, you can also save it as a JSON and you can export it to Excel. But we'll go ahead and render it as an SVG. So here we go. And now you kind of have to, you can see at a glance, oh, one more thing actually we want to do is you want to expand the annotated sub techniques. If you click this button, just so they're not hidden down there when we export it, you want to remember to do that. Almost forgot. And now we can render it again, and we can see all the techniques that we have, and we can take off some things if it's a little busy. I kind of like to just leave it with the map and legends. So I'm going to take off a few of these things just to make it look a little bit cleaner for sharing. And there we go. And yeah, so when you're done, you can save this now as a SVG, have it to your machine, and you can share it with whoever you want. And that's pretty much Navigator in a nutshell. You can do a lot more with it, but if you want to have lots of different other ransomware variants and combine all of them, you can do them up here in new tabs and just have different scores. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'll head back to the stream. And all right, are we back on the PowerPoint? Yeah, perfect.
Yes. So now we're going to be going over some tips and best practices, and then very quickly over some of those frequently asked questions at the end. So as far as tips and best practices go, here are just kind of a list of uh, tips that you can use to enhance your mapping. So for the first one, refer to procedure examples, review how behaviors are mapped and attacked. I've emphasized this a few times over the past several minutes, but procedures are a key part of mapping, as they're the examples of how those adversaries in the wild have specifically implemented this technique or sub. And so when you're mapping, this can be incredibly helpful in helping you determine if a behavior appropriately aligns with a technique or not. And then in the same vein, looking through techniques and sub-techniques to see how attack performs, technique analysis, and how we've mapped reports and similar activity in the past can be really beneficial as well. Another tip is to remember that not everything is a behavior. And, we went over this a little bit earlier, but there are a few reasons why you should remember this. So first, not everything is a behavior in the sense that it might just be a supporting detail. So it might be a specific registration information, or what an individual host name or IP or IP address or hash is. And so while these details you research or discover may not translate into behaviors, many of these details can build on each other to inform how you do end up mapping the behavior. You can also refer to the context around the activity to identify if it's malicious in nature. So, for example, tools used by the adversaries that aren't explicitly malicious, but their malicious usage was. Second, not everything is a behavior because we just don't have it in attack yet. And so we don't have every single malicious behavior in attack, and it's unlikely that we ever will. And so if you identify a behavior that you can't map to attack, don't disregard that in your analysis. Use it to help build out a more comprehensive picture, and then send us a contribution where the behavior is being used in the wild. And this also leads us to the next tip. If you can't find the behavior, map to the tactic level. So if you aren't able to map to the technique level, maybe because there aren't enough details or the behavior isn't in attack, you can still map to the tactic level. And this is a key part of understanding that adversary profile. So even without those more technical implementations or specific procedural details, mapping at the tactic level enables you to gain an understanding of what those adversary goals are, and that can inform the rest of your analysis. This one's specific to narrative reporting, but looking for those verbs in finished reporting that can often reveal what actions the adversaries are taking. So, for example, used malicious links, create scheduled tasks, and installed tools. And so kind of like looking for those verbs can often give you an idea of what the adversary is doing. And then have someone review your mappings. Having someone review your mappings is a really crucial part of the process. We all have these unconscious biases, and these can impact how we analyze and map behaviors. By comparing results to other analysts, we can start to recognize and circumvent those biases, and then also get additional valuable perspectives that can help inform more accurate mappings. The attack team has at least 2 members review and compare results for every single report. So this provides an opportunity to discuss differences in opinion and in perspective in mappings, and then differing interpretations of what a behavior is. And if you look to the left side of the slide, we have a couple of additional resources I'd like to highlight that can give some more best practices for mapping. So for the MAD CTI training, we have a lot of tips and best practices featured in the training. So if you haven't already taken a look at that, I would encourage you to go check it out. We also recommend the best practices for MITRE attack mapping that CISA published a few months ago. And CISA created this guide with the Homeland Security Systems Engineering and Development Institute. It's a DHS-owned FFRDC. And they worked with the attack team to develop this best practices guide to assist with mapping from finished and raw data. So moving on to some frequently asked questions on mapping, CTI training, and anything else. So starting out at the top, this is a question that we often get. There are so many attack techniques. How do I go about learning them? So there's no easy answer. You have to put in some effort. But examining the tactic descriptions and understanding what the adversaries are trying to achieve at that level, and then browsing down to the technique and sub-technique level to understand how they facilitate the tactics and how the adversaries are leveraging them is a good first step. But for a more targeted approach, you can also identify the specific adversaries that are likely to target your organization and take a look at the techniques they have used. You'll also find that obviously the more you use attack, the more familiar you're going to become with all of the techniques. The next question that we often get, do you have any tips on how to map CTI from raw? So I've gone over several tips for this, but at the end of the day, practice makes perfect. So as we went over earlier with the raw data, ensure you're researching anything that's unfamiliar, any unfamiliar concepts, functions, commands, and so on as you're mapping. The more you map from raw, the more effectively you're going to be able to do it. And then it's especially important when you're mapping from raw data that if you need to have someone review your mappings to provide that additional perspective and identify any of those details or behaviors that should be examined more closely.
Awesome, Amy. So some other questions we also get are, how do I maintain my attack skills after completing the course and certification? So for this, I would say to continue to use attack at your job and to keep practicing with mappings. Following a text Twitter page to learn about updates to the site can also help keep you informed when things get released, like how we added sub-techniques a few years ago, data sources, other things like that. If you ever feel rusty on your attack knowledge, you can also always retake the fundamentals course or CTI course or enroll in other ones to help stay up to date. So we also get asked, how can I ensure that my mappings are accurate? So we realize this can be tricky and difficult when you're first starting out, and we all have different biases that make it still hard for some of us who have been doing it for years. So like I said before, practicing definitely helps improve quality over time. Having accountability is also useful. So if you have a friend who's also studying for the course with you, you guys can practice mapping a report together and seeing if you guys end up with similar results and finding out how you guys had differences and to learn from it. Working with other analysts on mappings lends diversity of opinions and viewpoints, so it helps kind of remove some of that potential analyst bias. Reading through procedure examples is also super beneficial, as those mappings have already been reviewed by multiple people on like our core attack team. And I realize it can be a lot harder for techniques and sub-techniques that don't have a lot of examples. But in those cases, you can always read through the description and see if anything aligns and talk to your peers for insight as well. Then I guess we'll go, we're kind of running out of time, but I guess we can go through the rest of the questions. So how can I best prepare for the assessments? I would say the best thing to prepare for the assessments is to really nail down the hands-on exercises. I think knowledge in action, at least in my personal experience, really helps me retain something. I have to be doing it and practicing in order for something to stick. So if you wanted to practice, you could pick a group or software from attack that has like a large number of techniques documented, and then practice mapping outside the course material and see if you got the same results in terms of the techniques that you pulled out compared to what we have on our site. So it's one of the things I'd recommend. So, and then Amy, you want to hit the last question?
Yes, I will try to answer this very quickly since we're running out of time. Will taking this training help me get into the field of CTI? So yes. Attack is one of the globally recognized frameworks used across cybersecurity, particularly by CTI practitioners. And so understanding attack and being able to operationalize it for CTI is just a really key element that's going to be very beneficial to you as you either start out in CTI or as you're looking for CTI roles. A lot of employers are also looking for people who are familiar with attack, and that's usually a prereq for many CTI jobs. There's also a whole host of free resources in addition to our training. There are so many free resources and trainings and learning pathways out there for those who are getting started out and CTI are interested in getting into CTI. So I definitely recommend that you go out there and look into some of those. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hope that you enjoyed this thrilling 45 minutes. Jackie and I are going to be heading over to the MAD for CTI booth in a few minutes. So if you have any additional questions, if we weren't able to get to your questions in the chat, during the session, we're happy to address them over at the booth. Or if you just want to trade ransomware stories with us, please head over there. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amy and Jackie. As always, great information. You gave us great best practices and anecdotes from your own personal experiences, how to really do this job and leverage the tools that are out there. Our next session is going to be with Rich Struess and John Baker from the Center for Threat-Informed Defense, who are going to tell us more about the research and including the development of tools that the center has done for cyber threat intelligence, including things like Attack Workbench and TRAM. So I'm excited to pass this over to Rich and John for the next session.